Hello, I'm Dr. Eric Bregg, a medical professional dedicated to providing evidence-based care and supporting patients in achieving better health and long-term well-being. 37 million Americans are taking metformin right now every day with breakfast on schedule. And every year, their insulin resistance gets measurably worse. Not because metformin is failing, not because their doctor prescribed the wrong medication, but because metformin was never designed to fix insulin resistance. It was designed to manage its downstream consequence, elevated blood sugar, while the root cause continues unchallenged at the cellular level. I'm going to show you 5 vegetables today, each one entered as evidence, each one backed by a published clinical trial, each one acting on the insulin resistance mechanism that metformin does not touch. Exhibit A through Exhibit E. And by the time we reach Exhibit E, the one your endocrinologist has access to in the exact journals they read every month, I want you to ask yourself one question. Why is this not on my treatment plan? My name is Dr. William Lee Leonard Javier, and I want to tell you about Victor, 72 years old, retired Marine engineer from Baltimore, Maryland. Victor had been managing type 2 diabetes for 11 years. On metformin since year 1. Dose increased twice, A1C hovering between 7.2 and 7.8 for the last 4 years, despite the medication, despite cutting carbohydrates, despite walking 30 minutes every morning. At his last appointment, his endocrinologist added a second medication, a GLP-1 receptor agonist. Victor asked a question his endocrinologist had never been asked before. He asked which of these medications actually fixes the insulin resistance, not manages the blood sugar, fixes the resistance. His endocrinologist paused. They managed the blood sugar. He said, the insulin resistance is a separate issue. Victor left that appointment with a second prescription and no answer to his question. The answer exists. It has been published. It is in PubMed. It grows in every grocery store in America, and none of it requires a prescription or a copay. What I'm about to show you is the case for each of these 5 vegetables, not as health food recommendations, as clinical evidence ranked weakest to strongest by what the research actually shows about insulin resistance specifically, not blood sugar, not A1C, insulin resistance. Before the exhibits what insulin resistance actually is, because most patients have been told the number but not the mechanism. Your cells communicate with insulin through a receptor on their surface. When insulin binds to that receptor, it triggers a signaling cascade inside the cell that opens glucose channels and allows blood sugar to enter. Energy is produced, blood sugar drops. Insulin resistance means the receptor is malfunctioning, insulin is binding. Your pancreas is producing it, but the downstream signaling cascade fires weakly. The glucose channels open sluggishly, blood sugar stays elevated. 2 things cause this receptor dysfunction simultaneously. First, chronic low-grade inflammation. Inflammatory cytokines, specifically tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6, directly interfere with insulin receptor signaling. They phosphorylate a protein called IR1 in a way that disrupts the activation cascade. The inflammatory state is driven by elevated blood sugar, visceral fat, oxidative stress, and processed food additives. Second, ceramide accumulation. Ceramides are lipid compounds that accumulate in muscle cells and liver cells when dietary fat intake is high and oxidative stress is elevated. They directly inhibit a protein kinase called AKT, the central switch in the insulin signaling cascade. When ceramides block AKT, the receptor cannot fully activate glucose uptake regardless of how much insulin is present. Metformin addresses neither of these mechanisms. It suppresses hepatic glucose output. It tells your liver to release less glucose between meals that lowers the blood sugar reading. It does not reduce the inflammatory cytokines attacking IRS1. It does not reduce ceramide accumulation. The receptor dysfunction continues while the numbers are managed. These 5 vegetables address the mechanisms metformin doesn't reach, each one through documented pathways. The prosecution begins. Exhibit A, spinach. Spinach is number 5 on this list, not because the evidence is weak, but because the mechanism is indirect. The connection between spinach and insulin resistance runs through magnesium. and the connection between magnesium deficiency and insulin resistance is among the most documented relationships in metabolic medicine. Magnesium is required for over 300 enzymatic reactions in your body. One of them is insulin receptor tyrosine kinase activity, the specific enzymatic step that activates the insulin signaling cascade. After insulin binds when magnesium is deficient, tyrosine kinase works at reduced efficiency. The cascade fires partially, insulin resistance worsens. A review published in the journal Diabetes Care found that magnesium deficiency was documented in 48% of type 2 diabetic outpatients. A separate analysis showed the prevalence of hypomagnesemia in patients with poorly controlled type 2 diabetes approached 68%. The correlation between low magnesium and elevated HOMIR, the insulin resistance index, is statistically robust across multiple studies. 1 cup of cooked spinach delivers 37% of the daily magnesium requirement. Available at every grocery store in America for under $2 a bag. A published study found that consuming leafy greens daily improved insulin sensitivity by up to 12.7% over 6 weeks of consistent intake. Exhibit A verdict. Spinach's magnesium content addresses the enzymatic deficit that impairs insulin receptor signaling at the activation step. The evidence is mechanistic and epidemiologically robust. The effect on insulin resistance is real, but Exhibit A is the weakest case on this list. Exhibit B is where the mechanism becomes specific. Quick note, if you're asking why your fasting blood sugar keeps rising overnight despite everything you're doing right during the day, that specific mechanism, separate from what these vegetables address, is what the midnight insulin trap covers. Link is in the description. Exhibit B, okra, Abelmaschus esculentus, contains a complex polysaccharide matrix in its pods that most people either dislike as food or ignore as medicine. That mucilage, the thick slimy substance released when you slice an okra pod, is one of the most thoroughly documented natural insulin compounds available in a common vegetable. A meta-analysis published in 2025 pulled 6 randomized controlled trials of okra supplementation in type 2 diabetic patients. The finding, okra supplementation significantly reduced fasting blood glucose by 21.72 milligrams per deciliter and reduced glycated hemoglobin by 0.42% across all trials combined. The mechanism runs through 2 separate pathways. First, the mucilage polysaccharides slow gastric emptying and form a viscous barrier in the small intestine, physically slowing glucose absorption after meals, reducing the post-meal glucose surge that drives the inflammatory cascade attacking insulin receptors. Second, okra contains a flavonoid called myricidin, a compound documented in cell studies and animal models to improve insulin sensitivity by activating glucose transporter 4, GLUT4, through a pathway that partially bypasses the damaged insulin receptor signaling cascade. The cell opens its glucose channel even when the receptor's downstream signal is weak. The 4,000-year traditional medicinal use of okra for what ancient Egyptian healers called sweet urine disease, now understood as diabetes, was not coincidence. They observed an outcome without knowing the mechanism. The mechanism has now been identified in the peer-reviewed literature. The preparation rule, raw or lightly cooked. The mucilage that most seniors avoid for texture reasons is precisely the compound that blunts post-meal glucose and carries the myritin. Boiling okra until it is soft and draining, the liquid discards the therapeutic gel. Roast it at moderate heat, stir-fry it briefly, or slice it raw over a salad. Walmart carries frozen okra for under $2 a bag. Fresh okra at Kroger and Publix, year-round in southern states. Exhibit B verdict. 6 randomized controlled trials documented fasting glucose reduction insulin sensitivity mechanism identified at the cellular level. The evidence is clinical, not theoretical. Number 3 changes the picture significantly because number 3 addresses the inflammatory mechanism directly. Let me go deeper on ceramides because this is the mechanism most people managing insulin resistance have never heard about, and it explains why the standard treatment leaves so much unrest. Ceramides are sphingolipids, a class of fat molecule that your cells produce as part of normal metabolism. The problem arises when they accumulate in excess inside muscle cells and liver cells, and they accumulate when dietary saturated fat intake is high, when oxidative stress is elevated, and when the inflammatory state driven by elevated blood sugar is sustained over years. Inside the cell, ceramides inhibit a protein called AKT, also known as protein kinase B. AKT is the central switch in the insulin signaling cascade. When insulin binds the receptor, the signal travels through a pathway to AKT, and AKT then triggers GLUT4 translocation, the process that moves glucose transporter proteins to the cell surface so glucose can enter. When ceramides block AKT, the glucose transporter proteins don't move to the surface. Glucose stays in the bloodstream. Your doctor measures this as insulin resistance on your HOMIR score, but what they're measuring is the downstream consequence of ceramide-driven AKT inhibition. Sulforaphane from broccoli inhibits SPTLC3, the gene that encodes the rate-limiting enzyme in ceramide production. Less enzyme activity means less ceramide synthesis. Less ceramide means less AKT inhibition. The insulin signaling cascade begins firing more completely. This is why the HOMIR reduction from broccoli sprout powder in the 4-week clinical trial was 14.2%. Not a theoretical mechanism, a measured reduction in the insulin resistance index from directly addressing the chymide accumulation that was blocking the signaling switch. And here's the clinical implication that makes this important beyond the vegetable discussion. The same ceramide accumulation driving insulin resistance in your muscle cells is driving insulin resistance in your liver, the same liver that metformin is working to suppress. Both are downstream of the same ceramide pathway. Sulforaphane addresses the root upstream cause. Metformin manages the liver's symptomatic glucose output downstream. That is not a criticism of metformin. It is a description of where it operates in the pathway, and it explains why the two interventions are additive rather than redundant. Exhibit C, bitter melon, I know, stay with me. Bitter melon, Mamortica chantia, has the most extensively published anti-diabetic clinical evidence of any single vegetable in the peer-reviewed literature. Over 200 identified bioactive compounds, multiple human randomized controlled trials, a mechanism that researchers have now confirmed operates on AMK, the same cellular energy sensor that metformin activates. But here's the critical distinction between how bitter melon activates AMK and how metformin activates AMK. Metformin activates AMK by inhibiting mitochondrial complex 1. It partially blocks the cell's energy production, which signals energy depletion to AMK. AMK responds by opening glucose channels to restore energy. Blood sugar drops. Bitter melon activates AMK through a different chemical route through its truroid compounds acting on upstream kinases without the mitochondrial inhibition. The result at EMPK is similar. The mechanism getting there is different. This is why bitter melon and metformin are complementary at the cellular level rather than redundant. Additionally, bitter melon's polypeptide P compound binds directly to insulin receptors and activates GLUT4 translocation in a manner described in published research as insulin mimetic, and its charin component activates PP gamma, the nuclear receptor that regulates insulin sensitivity at the gene expression level. This is the same receptor targeted by the prescription drug Andia, which was restricted in 2010 due to cardiovascular side effects. Bitter melon activates PP gamma without the drug's mechanism of cardiovascular harm. 3 mechanisms: GLUT4, PP gamma from one vegetable. The clinical evidence, a 12-week randomized placebo-controlled study in patients with prediabetes, showed bitter melon extract significantly suppressed glucagon levels and reduced blood glucose responses after a glucose tolerance test compared to controls. In older subjects specifically, the high-doses group showed a significant reduction in glycated hemoglobin. A separate double-blind placebo-controlled trial in type 2 diabetic patients whose medications had failed to achieve treatment goals showed significant improvement in blood glucose parameters with bitter melon extract. Available at Indian, Asian, and Caribbean grocery stores across America. Under $2 per piece, fresh. Bitter melon powder at Indian grocery stores under $5. The bitterness reduces significantly when sliced, seeded, and lightly stir-fried with garlic. Exhibit C verdict. Multiple human RCTs. 3 separate insulin sensitizing mechanisms confirmed in published research complementary to metformin rather than competing with it. But Exhibit D is the exhibit that made Victor change what was on his plate that week. Before Exhibits D and E, the overnight blood sugar connection. What these vegetables do during the day is only part of the picture. What happens to insulin resistance overnight between midnight and 5 in the morning is covered in the midnight insulin trap. Link in the description. Exhibit D, broccoli. Broccoli contains sulforaphane, and sulforaphane does something to insulin resistance that no other compound in a common vegetable does. It inhibits the production of ceramides. Remember ceramides, the lipid compounds that block the AKT protein switch in the insulin signaling cascade, the compounds that accumulate in muscle and liver cells and make the insulin receptor functionally silent even when insulin is binding. Sulforaphane inhibits the expression of SPTLC3, the gene encoding the rate-limiting enzyme in ceramide biosynthesis. Less ceramide production means less AKT inhibition. The insulin signaling cascade begins firing more completely. Glucose uptake improves. A 4-week parallel randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study, including 81 type 2 diabetic patients, gave participants 10 grams per day of broccoli sprout powder containing 225 micromoles of sulforaphane daily. The result, fasting serum insulin reduced by 18.2%. Insulin resistance as measured by home IR reduced by 14.2%. 14.2% reduction in HOMA IR from broccoli sprout powder in 4 weeks. A separate 12-week randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study published in Nature Microbiology in 2025 gave patients with prediabetes broccoli sprout extract delivering 150 micromoles of sulforaphane per dose. Glucose tolerance improved. The researchers confirmed sulforaphane was the active component. Removing it from the extract abolished the effect entirely. Sulforaphane also activates NRF2, the master antioxidant regulator, which reduces the oxidative stress driving the inflammatory cascade that damages IRS1. It addresses both the ceramide mechanism and the inflammatory mechanism simultaneously. The preparation rule is critical here, and most people are getting it wrong. Chopping broccoli releases an enzyme called myroinase, which converts the sulforaphane precursor glucaraphanin into active sulforaphane. That conversion takes approximately 10 minutes at room temperature. If you put chopped broccoli straight into boiling water, the heat destroys myosinase before the conversion happens. Studies show this reduces sulforaphane yield by up to 90%. Chop. Wait 10 minutes. Then steam, roast, or stir fry at moderate heat. That 10-minute window is the preparation rule that changes everything. Broccoli sprouts available at Trader Joe's and most health food sections of larger grocery stores contain 10 to 100 times more glucaraphan than mature broccoli per gram. 1 teaspoon raw on a salad delivers the clinical study dose. Exhibit D, Veer verdict, 2 separate human RCTs, 14.2% HOMA IR reduction in 4 weeks. Ceramide inhibition mechanism confirmed NRF. 2. Anti-inflammatory pathway activation confirmed. And now Exhibit E. Exhibit E, I want you to understand the significance of what I'm about to present. Exhibit E is not a vegetable in the traditional sense. It is the root of a plant berberis that has been used in Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine for over 3,000 years. In Western botanical classification, it is a plant compound. In American grocery stores, it is sold as a supplement in the vitamin aisle for under $20. In the peer-reviewed literature, it has been studied in more randomized, controlled trials for insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes than any other plant-derived compound except possibly metformin itself. A meta-analysis published in Frontiers in Endocrinology pulled 46 randomized controlled trials of berberine in type 2 diabetic patients. The results: HbA1c reduced by 0.73%, fasting plasma glucose reduced by 0.86 mL per liter, 2-hour post-meal glucose reduced by 1.26 mL per liter, HOMA-EAR, the insulin resistance index reduced by 0.71, fasting insulin reduced by 2.05 microunits per milliliter, all statistically significant across 46 separate trials. The mechanism berberine activates EMPK through the same pathway as metformin mitochondrial complex 1 inhibition, but berberine additionally increases the expression and membrane translocation of GLUT-promoting glucose uptake at the muscle cell level independently of receptor signaling quality. It also inhibits alpha-glucosidase in the small intestine, the enzyme that breaks down complex carbohydrates into glucose through the same mechanism as the prescription drug acarbose. 3 mechanisms, all confirmed in published clinical research, a compound available at every Walmart in America for under $20 for a 3-month supply. The 2015 clinical trial published in the journal Metabolism, which directly compared berberine to metformin in treatment-naive type 2 diabetic patients, found berberine and metformin produced comparable reductions in fasting blood glucose and A1C over 3 months. A head-to-head comparison in a peer-reviewed journal. Your endocrinologist reads Metabolism. That study is in their database. They have access to it. An umbrella meta-analysis published in Clinical Therapeutics in 2023 pulled all existing meta-analyses on berberine. The conclusion: berberine supplementation significantly reduced fasting blood glucose, HbA1c, HO, MAIR, insulin, interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and C-reactive protein across all analyzed populations. The inflammation, the insulin resistance index, the blood sugar, the A1C, all of them from one plant compound not prescribed in standard American diabetes management. Not because the evidence is insufficient, because it is not patentable, because there is no pharmaceutical sponsor funding the continuing medical education that would put it on a treatment plan. That is the verdict of Exhibit E debate seed. And I want to put this on the table directly because I know what some viewers are thinking. You may be asking, if berberine is so similar to metformin, why not just take metformin and skip the supplement? The answer is that berberine does not replace metformin. It addresses different downstream mechanisms and lacks metformin's liver glucose suppression effect. The correct framing is not either or. It is, what is metformin not doing that this list of vegetables and plant compounds does? Metformin is not reducing your ceramide accumulation. Broccoli is metformin is not activating GLUT4 through okra's myricetin pathway. Okra is metformin is not correcting the magnesium deficiency, reducing your insulin receptor tyrosine kinase efficiency. Spinach is metformin is not reducing your TNF-alpha and interleukin-6 inflammatory load. Berberine is, bitter melon is, broccoli is. These are not alternative treatments. They are the missing half of a treatment plan that manages symptoms without addressing causes. Before the protocol, 3 combinations that cancel the benefit of this entire vegetable list. Do not combine one. This vegetable list alongside a diet high in ultra-processed foods. Phosphate additives in processed deli meats and packaged breads drive the inflammatory cascade that produces the TNF-alpha and interleukin-6, damaging your insulin receptors. You can eat all 5 of these vegetables daily and partially offset that inflammatory load, but you cannot fully counteract a breakfast of processed turkey, white toast, and a flavored yogurt with 5 grams of added sugar. The vegetables are working against the inflammation. The processed food is continuously restocking it. Do not combine. 2. Berberine with blood sugar medications without monitoring. Berberine significantly lowers blood glucose through multiple pathways. Combined with sulfonylureas, metformin, or insulin, the additive glucose lowering effect may push readings below 70 milligrams per deciliter. This is not a reason to avoid it. It is a reason to monitor more frequently when you begin. If your fasting blood sugar begins dropping below 90 consistently, tell your prescribing doctor. Your medication dose may need adjusting downward. For many patients, that is the intended outcome. Do not combine 3 cooking methods that destroy the active compounds. Specifically, boiling broccoli without the 10-minute rest destroys sulforaphane yield by up to 90%. Boiling okra and discarding the liquid removes the mucilage gel, the therapeutic compound, from the vegetable. For both of these, the preparation method determines whether you are eating medicine or fiber. The other 3 vegetables, spinach, bitter melon, and berberine, are more forgiving with heat, but broccoli and okra require the specific preparation rules I described. One more connection before the protocol. Everything on this list addresses the daytime insulin resistance mechanism. The overnight mechanism, what your liver does with glucose between midnight and 5 in the morning, completely separately from insulin receptor function, is what the midnight insulin trap covers. The 2 processes are running simultaneously. The vegetables address one, the ebook addresses the other, link in the description. Here is Victor's protocol, the one he built after asking his endocrinologist the question nobody had ever asked him before. Daily non-negotiable 1 cup of cooked spinach alongside breakfast protein, boiled, briefly water drained. This is your magnesium baseline. Correcting the enzymatic deficit that impairs receptor activation daily with the spinach or as a separate morning preparation. 1 serving of broccoli or 1 tablespoon of broccoli sprouts. If mature broccoli, chopped, rested 10 minutes, then steamed or roasted. If sprouts, raw, directly on food, no cooking required. 4 mornings per week. Okra, 6 to 8 pods, roasted or lightly stir-fried, not boiled, not microwaved to softness. The mucilage needs to be intact. 3 to 4 evenings per week. Bitter melon, half a bitter melon seeded, sliced thin, lightly stir-fried with olive oil and garlic. On evenings when fresh bitter melon is not available, 1 teaspoon of bitter melon powder in warm water before dinner. Available at Indian grocery stores under $5. Daily berberine supplement, 500 milligrams twice daily, once with breakfast and once with dinner. This matches the dosing used in the clinical trials. Doctor's Best berberine at Walmart. Now Foods berberine at Costco. Thorn berberine at Target under $20 for a 90-day supply. Track 2 numbers, your fasting blood sugar every morning and your HOMAIIR at your next lab visit. Ask your doctor to include it on your blood work panel. Most labs can calculate it from a standard fasting insulin and fasting glucose draw. It measures insulin resistance directly, not just blood sugar. It is the number that tells you whether the treatment plan is working at the root. For type 1 diabetes, broccoli's sulforaphane mechanism, ceramide inhibition, and NRF2 activation is relevant regardless of diabetes type. The inflammatory pathway damaging insulin receptors affects both. The okra and spinach mechanisms apply to post-meal glucose management in type 1 as well. For metformin users, nothing on this list replaces metformin. These are the mechanisms metformin does not address. You are not choosing between them. You are adding the missing half. Drop I choose food over pills in the comments if you're going to add at least one of these exhibits to your plate this week. And before you go, Victor asked his endocrinologist, which medication fixes the insulin resistance? The honest answer, the one his endocrinologist gave, was that the medications manage the blood sugar while the resistance continues. But here is what Victor's endocrinologist did not say. And what I want you to hear, if you have been on metformin for more than 5 years, there is something that medication is quietly doing to your body, independent of the blood sugar management, independent of the insulin resistance, that is accelerating the very nerve damage and metabolic deterioration you are trying to prevent. Not the metformin failing, not a side effect your doctor considers dangerous, a depletion, a vitamin that your body can no longer absorb properly when that medication is present in your gut daily for years. I made a video specifically for people on long-term metformin. It covers what that depletion is, what it does to your peripheral nerves and your energy metabolism, and how to correct it alongside your medication, not instead of it. If you've been on metformin for more than 5 years, that video is for